The construction crew arrived at dawn on a Tuesday in early September, their equipment rumbling across what Thomas Brennan had always known as his private lake. Thomas, a 47-year-old civil engineer who'd inherited the 12-acre island property from his grandfather, stood on his dock watching massive pilings being driven into the lakebed without his permission. The sound echoed across the water like a violation he could feel in his chest. For 3 months, the Lakeshore Estates HOA had been sending threatening letters about his non-compliance with community standards, his refusal to attend their meetings, his island being an eyesore visible from their precious shoreline homes. Thomas had ignored them all, secure in the knowledge that his island predated their development by 60 years. But this morning, watching them build an unauthorized bridge from their community dock straight to his property, Thomas realized they'd escalated beyond letters. They'd made the biggest mistake of their entitled lives. Because what the HOA president and her crew didn't know was that Thomas didn't just own the island. He owned the entire waterway, and he was about to teach them a very expensive lesson about property rights. Before we dive into how Thomas shut down an entire HOA's illegal construction project, if you love stories where entitled people learn that property deeds matter more than community power trips, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, this one's worth watching until the end. Now let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The harassment that pushed a property owner to his breaking point, the confrontation where an engineer's patience turned into calculated action, and the resolution where an HOA learned that bullying the wrong person costs more than money. The first part reveals Thomas's quiet life on his family island, inherited through 3 generations of Brennan ownership, and how a newly empowered HOA board decided his private property was somehow their jurisdiction. You'll see the escalating demands, the threatening fines for violations that legally couldn't exist, and the morning Thomas discovered construction equipment trespassing on his lakebed. The emotional toll of watching strangers invade a place filled with childhood memories, the frustration of being treated like a subordinate on his own land, and the moment he stopped being polite and started being strategic. The second part captures the confrontation, where Thomas used his engineering, expertise, and legal knowledge to corner an HOA president who thought community bylaws trumped century-old property deeds. Watch as he reveals exactly how much research he'd done, the identities and vulnerabilities of every board member involved, and the legal nightmare they'd just created for themselves. The power shift is immediate and devastating. As the woman who'd been sending threatening letters realizes she's been threatening someone holding all the actual cards. The third part delivers justice. As Thomas exercises rights the HOA never knew existed, turns their illegal bridge into an expensive dismantling project, and ensures every board member personally understands the cost of their arrogance. The resolution includes unexpected twists, community fallout, and a peaceful ending where Thomas finally gets what he'd wanted all along, to be left alone on his family's island. Here's exactly how it happened. Thomas Brennan had never wanted to be part of Lakeshore Estates. His 12-acre island, connected to the mainland only by a narrow private boat launch on the opposite shore, had belonged to his family since 1962, when his grandfather purchased the land and built the modest cabin that Thomas now called home year-round. Thomas worked as a senior civil engineer for the State Transportation Department, a job that taught him patience, precision, and the absolute importance of permits and property boundaries. He lived alone since his divorce 3 years earlier, finding peace in the isolation his ex-wife had called suffocating. His nearest neighbor was technically a quarter-mile across the water, where Lakeshore Estates had been developed in 2019 on what used to be farmland. Thomas had watched the construction from his porch, unbothered by the distant houses, assuming the new residents would respect the lake's quiet traditions. He'd been catastrophically wrong. The problem started in late May when Thomas received his first letter from the Lakeshore Estates HOA. The letter, signed by President Patricia Voss, informed him that his property was visible from community docks and walking trails, and therefore subject to their architectural standards. Thomas needed to repaint his cabin's weathered gray siding to match approved earth tones, remove the vintage fishing boat tied to his dock as it was an eyesore, and attend the next HOA meeting to discuss integration into community standards. Thomas had laughed, crumpled the letter, and thrown it away. His property predated their development by nearly 60 years. Their HOA had exactly zero authority over his island. He assumed that would be the end of it. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later, this time with a formal notice of violation stamped in red across the top. The HOA claimed Thomas had failed to respond to their previous correspondence and was now being fined $200 for noncompliance. Additional violations included unmowed grass visible from community shoreline and unapproved dock structure. The letter demanded payment within 30 days and attendance at their July meeting. Thomas called the number listed, reaching Patricia Voss directly. She'd been pleasant but firm, explaining that all properties surrounding Lakeshore Lake, as she called it, fell under HOA jurisdiction per their community charter. Thomas had explained, with strained patience, that his island was private property with its own deed, that the lake had been called Brennan's Lake on county maps since the 1960s, and that her HOA had no legal authority over property it didn't own. Patricia had responded with a tone that made Thomas's jaw clench. She said perhaps he didn't understand how HOAs worked, that community standards applied to everyone, and that his refusal to cooperate was creating problems for property values. Thomas had hung up and immediately pulled his property deed from his file cabinet, photographing every page as evidence he might need later. The harassment continued through July and August. The HOA sent letters demanding he remove trees blocking their view, repaint his dock to match their approved colors, and eliminate the rope swing his grandfather had installed over the water in 1975 as it posed a liability risk visible to their residents. Each letter included escalating fines now totaling $1,800. Thomas contacted a property attorney who confirmed what he already knew. The HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over his island, and their fines were legally meaningless. But the attorney also warned that sometimes HOAs got aggressive, pushing boundaries until someone pushed back hard enough to make them stop. Thomas had nodded, filed the consultation notes, and decided to ignore the HOA completely while documenting every letter they sent. Then came the morning of September 5th, when Thomas walked to his dock with his coffee and saw the construction barge. Heavy equipment sat on a floating platform 200 feet from his shore, positioned exactly where the HOA's community dock ended and open water began. Workers were driving pilings into the lakebed, the metallic hammering shattering the morning silence Thomas cherished. He grabbed his binoculars and confirmed his worst suspicion. They were building a bridge, an actual pedestrian bridge extending from their community dock toward his island. Thomas stood there for 20 minutes, rage building in his chest like pressure behind a dam about to break, watching strangers work on his lakebed without permission, without permits, without any legal right to be there. He'd spent 3 months trying to be reasonable, ignoring their baseless demands, assuming their harassment would eventually end. Instead, they'd decided to physically invade his property. Thomas went inside, pulled out his property deed, and started making phone calls, first to his attorney, then to the county planning office, then to the state environmental agency. Because what Patricia Voss and her HOA board clearly didn't know was that when Thomas's grandfather bought this island in 1962, he'd purchased not just the land but the entire lake surrounding it, all 47 acres of Waterway, as a single parcel to prevent exactly this kind of development. The deed was explicit. Brennan's Lake, the lakebed, the water rights, all of it belonged to Thomas. And that bridge they were building? They were trespassing on his property, driving pilings into his lakebed, violating environmental regulations, and doing it all without permits because no government agency would ever approve construction on privately owned waterway. Thomas had been willing to ignore their ridiculous letters. But now they'd crossed a line that would cost them everything. If they wanted to play property games, Thomas would show them what happened when you picked a fight with someone who actually understood property law. And on September 5th, at exactly 11:30 in the morning, Thomas climbed into his boat and headed toward that construction barge to introduce himself properly. Thomas cut his boat's engine 50 feet from the construction barge, letting momentum carry him close enough to make eye contact with the workers. Four men in hard hats looked up from their equipment, surprised to see someone approaching. Thomas recognized the company name on their vests. Larson Marine Construction, a legitimate outfit that clearly had no idea they were working on private property. He called out calmly, his engineering background giving him the professional tone of someone who dealt with construction sites daily. He asked who authorized this project. A younger worker pointed toward shore where Patricia Voss stood on the HOA dock with two other board members, watching the construction with satisfied expressions. Thomas nodded, tied his boat to the barge with practiced ease, and climbed aboard. He pulled out his phone, opened to the photographed deed he'd prepared that morning, and told the crew foreman they needed to see something before driving another piling. The foreman, a weathered man in his 50s named Ray, took Thomas's phone and read the first page of the deed. His face went from confused to concerned to professionally blank in about 30 seconds. Thomas explained in clear, unemotional terms that this entire lake was private property, that no permits existed for this construction because none could legally be issued, and that Larson Marine Construction was currently trespassing on a privately owned waterway while damaging a protected lake bed. Ray's response was immediate and defensive. He said the HOA had hired them 3 weeks ago, showed permits, paid a deposit, and assured them this was approved community infrastructure. Thomas asked to see those permits. Ray retrieved a folder from the barge office, and Thomas flipped through documents he recognized instantly as fraudulent. HOA letterhead designed to look official, but 0 county stamps, 0 state environmental approval, 0 actual permitting authority. He showed Ray the county planning office number on his phone screen and suggested he call immediately to verify. Ray made the call, spoke for 5 minutes, and when he hung up, his expression told Thomas everything he needed to know. The county had no record of any permits. Larson Marine Construction was working on an illegal project, and Ray knew his company was now liable for environmental violations and property damage. Thomas thanked Ray for his professionalism and said he'd deal with whoever hired him. He climbed back into his boat and motored directly to the HOA dock where Patricia Voss waited with her arms crossed. She looked to be in her early 60s, wearing expensive athleisure clothes and the expression of someone accustomed to getting her way. She spoke before Thomas could, her voice sharp with authority. She said he was interrupting approved construction, that he had no right to interfere with HOA business, and that she'd call the authorities if he didn't leave community property immediately. Thomas stepped onto the dock, technically his dock built over his lake bed, and smiled for the first time all morning. Then he started talking. He addressed Patricia by her full name. Patricia Ann Voss, age 63, residing at 847 Lakeshore Drive, married to Gerald Voss, who owned Voss Financial Planning in town. He mentioned her 2 board members by name as well, Trevor Harding, the treasurer, who worked as a regional manager for a telecommunications company and lived at 831 Lakeshore Drive, and Michelle Kowalski, the secretary, who taught elementary school and lived at 852 Lakeshore Drive. He knew their mortgage amounts, their property values, their jobs, and their personal liability exposure. Thomas had spent 3 days researching every person who'd signed those threatening letters to him, and now he wanted them to understand exactly how thoroughly he'd prepared for this moment. Patricia's confidence wavered, but she recovered, demanding to know how he had that information. Thomas explained that property records were public, social media was revealing, and when someone spent 3 months harassing a civil engineer who worked for the state transportation department, that engineer had access to resources she clearly hadn't considered. He said he knew she'd presented fake permits to Larson Marine Construction, that she'd authorized unpermitted construction on private property, and that she'd done it all while sending him fraudulent fines for violations that never legally existed. Then Thomas pulled out his own phone and showed her the same property deed he'd shown the construction crew. He watched her face as she read the description of the parcel. 47 acres of waterway surrounding Brennan's Island, purchased in full in 1962, owned continuously by the Brennan family, 0 HOA authority. 0 exceptions, Patricia tried to argue. She said the lake was common property, that their development attorney had assured them community waters fell under HOA jurisdiction, that Thomas couldn't possibly own an entire lake. Thomas interrupted her with the calm precision of someone who'd already won. He said her development attorney had either lied or never actually checked the deed history. That common property lake developments required explicit easements or shared ownership structures that didn't exist here, and that the HOA's own property descriptions specifically excluded the waterway because the developer who sold them their lots knew he didn't own it. Then Thomas laid out exactly what was happening next. He gave Patricia 3 options. Option 1, stop construction immediately, dismantle everything they'd built, restore his lake bed to original condition within 72 hours, and he'd consider not pursuing legal action or reporting the environmental violations to state agencies. Option 2, continue construction and he'd file for an immediate injunction, sue every board member personally for property damage and trespassing, report the fake permits to county authorities, and ensure Larson Marine Construction sued the HOA for fraud since they'd been lied to about permits. Option 3, try to argue or delay, and he'd skip straight to option 2 while also exercising his rights as waterway owner to revoke all HOA access to the lake, including their community dock that extended over his lake bed without his permission. Patricia started to protest, but Thomas wasn't finished. He explained that his property deed included complete water rights, meaning he controlled access to this entire lake. The HOA dock, their kayak launch, their swimming area, all of it existed on his property without any easement or permission. He'd tolerated it because he believed in neighborly courtesy, and because his grandfather had always allowed community access. But now, after 3 months of harassment and an illegal construction project, Thomas was reevaluating his generosity. He could legally post no trespassing signs around the entire waterway perimeter and prohibit all HOA access immediately. Their property values, so precious they'd harassed him about his cabin's paint color, would collapse overnight if residents learned they'd bought lakefront homes with no actual lake access. Trevor Harding finally spoke up, his voice uncertain, asking if Thomas was serious about shutting down their dock. Thomas turned to him with the same engineering calm he used in project meetings and said he was absolutely serious. He said he'd been willing to peacefully coexist, to let them enjoy the lake his family had owned for 6 decades, to overlook their ignorant harassment as long as they stayed on their side of the water. But they'd decided to build a bridge into his property without permission, using fake permits, while sending him legally meaningless fines. So yes, he was absolutely serious. They had 72 hours to dismantle everything and restore his lake bed. After that, he'd exercise whatever property rights he deemed necessary. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but Thomas was already walking back to his boat. He called over his shoulder that his attorney would be sending formal documentation by end of business today, and that Larson Marine Construction had already stopped work and would be sending them a bill for wasted time and equipment rental. He climbed into his boat, started the engine, and headed back to his island, while 3 board members stood on the dock realizing they'd just threatened someone who held every legal advantage they thought they'd had. Thomas didn't look back. He was done being polite. Now he was going to show them exactly what property rights actually meant. The dismantling began at dawn the next morning. Thomas sat on his porch with coffee and binoculars, watching Larson Marine Construction return, with different equipment, this time for removal instead of construction. Ray, the foreman, had called Thomas personally the previous afternoon to apologize, explain that his company had been misled about permits, and ask permission to access the waterway to dismantle what they'd built. Thomas had granted permission, graciously even offering his dock if they needed additional staging area. Ray had thanked him, mentioned that Larson Marine was billing the HOA triple time for emergency dismantling work, and said they'd be filing a complaint with county authorities about the fraudulent permits. Thomas had smiled and wished him efficient work. The crew worked for 2 full days, extracting pilings, removing concrete, and hauling away all materials. Thomas documented everything with time-stamped photographs, creating a record of the violation and its correction. On the 2nd afternoon, a county inspector arrived in an official boat to assess environmental damage to the lake bed. Thomas met him at the construction site, provided copies of his property deed and the fake permits Patricia had used, and answered questions about whether he wanted to press charges. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Garcia who clearly dealt with this kind of property dispute regularly, explained that the county could fine the HOA for unpermitted construction and environmental violations, but criminal charges would require Thomas to file complaints personally. Thomas considered this carefully. He said he'd decide after seeing whether the HOA completed restoration work within his deadline. The 72-hour deadline expired on Monday morning at 11 a.m. Thomas motored over to inspect the site at 11:15. The bridge components were completely gone, pilings extracted, and the lakebed looked reasonably restored, though it would take months for disturbed sediment to fully settle. Thomas was examining the water clarity when he heard a boat engine approaching. Patricia Voss navigated a small pontoon boat toward him, alone this time, her expression lacking the arrogant confidence from their previous confrontation. She asked if he was satisfied with the restoration work. Thomas said it was adequate, though he'd be monitoring the site for continuing damage. Patricia nodded, then asked what he planned to do about the HOA dock. Thomas had expected this conversation. He'd spent the weekend reviewing his options with his attorney and making decisions about how hard to push this resolution. He could legally revoke all HOA lake access immediately, post no trespassing signs, and enforce his property rights to their absolute limit. The HOA's property values would crater, residents would sue their board for misrepresentation, and Patricia's tenure as president would end in scandal. It would be satisfying revenge for 3 months of harassment. But Thomas had also realized something important. He didn't actually want to be the person who ruined his neighbors' lives. He just wanted to be left alone on his family's island. He told Patricia he'd make her a deal. The HOA would sign a formal access easement acknowledging that the entire Waterway was his private property, that their community dock existed by his permission only, and that any future construction or changes required his written approval. The easement would include explicit language that his island, his structures, and his landscaping were completely outside HOA jurisdiction, and that any future harassment would result in immediate access revocation. In exchange, Thomas would grant them permanent lake access for their current dock and swimming area, wouldn't pursue legal action for the bridge incident, and wouldn't report the fake permits to county prosecutors. Patricia would also need to resign as HOA president within 30 days and ensure the new board understood these terms. Thomas held up his phone, showing the access easement his attorney had already drafted, and asked if she accepted. Patricia's face went through several emotions: relief, humiliation, resignation, anger, before settling on defeated acceptance. She asked why he was offering this deal instead of just destroying them legally. Thomas said that despite their behavior, he believed in being a good neighbor, and that he recognized most Lakeshore Estates residents had no idea about the harassment campaign their board had run. He said he'd lived here peacefully for years before their development existed and wanted to return to that peace, but he needed Patricia to understand that this deal was contingent on absolute compliance. No more letters, no more demands, no more assumptions that community standards applied to private property they didn't own. If she or any future board violated these terms, he'd exercise his full property rights without warning or negotiation. Patricia asked about the other board members. Thomas said Trevor and Michelle could stay on the board if they wanted, but they'd need to sign personal acknowledgments that they understood the terms and their previous violations. He said his attorney would send documents to all 3 of them, and they had 1 week to sign and return them. After that, the easement would be filed with the county and become part of the permanent property record. Patricia nodded slowly and asked one final question. She wanted to know how much of this Thomas had known from the beginning. Had he always known he owned the Waterway? Thomas smiled and said he'd inherited detailed property records from his grandfather, including the original survey maps and water rights documentation. He'd known exactly what he owned from day one. He'd just never needed to prove it until someone pushed him far enough to make documentation necessary. Patricia looked at him with something between respect and resentment. She said she'd underestimated him badly. Thomas agreed and said that was the danger of making assumptions about people based on their willingness to be accommodating. Just because he'd ignored their letters didn't mean he was powerless. It meant he'd been choosing peace over conflict. But when they'd built that bridge, they'd eliminated his ability to choose peace. Patricia climbed back into her pontoon boat without another word. Thomas watched her motor back to the community dock, then returned to his island to wait for the signed documents his attorney would be sending. The easement documents arrived signed from all 3 board members within 5 days. Patricia submitted her resignation as HOA president 2 weeks later, citing personal reasons in a brief email to residents. Thomas heard through the grapevine that a community meeting had been called where the full bridge incident was explained to residents, that several homeowners had been furious at the board's actions, and that the new president had sent Thomas a formal apology letter acknowledging the previous board's mistakes. Thomas filed that letter with the easement paperwork and considered the matter closed. 2 months later, on a cool November morning, Thomas sat on his porch swing with fresh coffee and a book, watching early sunlight paint gold across water so still it perfectly mirrored the sky. His island was silent except for birds and the occasional fish jumping near shore. The rope swing his grandfather had installed still hung over the water where it had belonged for 50 years. His cabin's weathered gray siding remained beautifully unpainted. His vintage fishing boat rocked gently at the dock. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly as it had been before Patricia Voss decided community standards mattered more than property deeds. Thomas's phone buzzed with a message from his attorney. The county had officially filed the access easement, and the property records now clearly showed Brennan ownership of the full waterway with HOA access granted by permission only. Thomas replied with thanks, set his phone down, and returned to his book. Across the water, he could see families on the HOA beach, children swimming, kayakers paddling near shore. They were enjoying his lake, using his water, accessing his property, all with his permission as it should have always been understood. Thomas had learned something important through this whole experience. Justice didn't always require destroying your opponents. Sometimes it just required teaching them that power comes from ownership, not from the ability to send threatening letters. And as Thomas sat there in perfect peace, surrounded by 4 generations of family history on an island that would remain his alone, he smiled. Because sometimes the best revenge wasn't burning down your enemy's world. Sometimes it was simply reminding them who actually owned the ground they stood on. Across the state in Hillsborough, Oregon, retired patent attorney Elizabeth Crane received a certified letter informing her that her beachfront cottage, owned by her family since 1954, was being seized through eminent domain for a luxury hotel development. The developer's lawyer had been confident, almost smug, explaining that local government approval was final. Elizabeth had smiled, the same smile that once preceded 30 years of courtroom victories, and pulled out the original land grant showing her property included mineral rights, water rights, and a historical designation the developer's research had somehow missed. She'd made one phone call to a federal preservation office, and suddenly the developer was facing injunctions, environmental reviews, and the attention of agencies that made local approval meaningless. The lawyer had gone pale. But that's a story for another time.